All right, kia ora koutou katoa, ko Jonnie Haddon aho. Yes, look, Alex is very kind and don't believe half the things he says. I'm actually a little bit nervous to this audience. I sort of speak a little bit at things every now and then, but my normal audience is not a technical audience. It's like a government innovation crowd. Yes, those two things do exist. Someone laughed. Yeah, those two words have like met each other once, occasionally as they passed. But yeah, look, I do enjoy working with government and, you know, getting alongside partners like Alex, you know, to bring a real technical expertise into the work that they're doing has been a privilege. So who here has worked on a government project? Yeah? Yes. Okay, you're all very familiar. Who here is, did the procurement ever take longer than the project? Yeah, always? Yeah, it's a bit like that, right? So this is what I want to talk to about today, is that I think, and I'm going to give you a bit of a reason as to why I think government is starting to change, at least here in New Zealand, to be more primed and ready for the type of work that I know if you're anything like X equals, and I get the sense that you all are, that actually government is perhaps more willing than it's ever been to work with smaller, more innovative, more agile agencies than they've ever been, rather than, you know, the big old crowd. So look, you would have heard it, that the pains, you would have experienced the pains of slow, difficult procurement, and, you know, you might start out and 6 months in, you've still only got a 100-page document of features and requirements and all of these types of things, and you haven't actually started it. You know, you finally get into working with the vendor, and, you know, it seemingly takes forever, and the project doesn't feel like it ships. And all of these frustrations are real, and I guess we've seen it. So my area of innovation and GovTech has really spent. What I want to do is talk to you a bit about the last 10 years, and because I think that's really important to unpicking why the next 10, I hope, will be very different. So just a little bit about where I'm coming from. So as Alex said, I've run innovation programs for government, and getting senior leadership buy-in is always so important. So these are some of the sort of elected officials who have worked on projects that we've run. I've worked on sort of 70 plus different initiatives, public sector innovation type deliveries over the last 10 years. I've worked internationally, mostly in New Zealand though, but a little bit sort of around APAC. I'm part of a global group called the Global GovTech Alliance, and am sort of the only New Zealand member. There's one in Australia, actually, in Canberra, and also part of the World Bank's GovTech Partnership Program. So I guess, as I said, what I really want to urge for today and argue for is that something has shifted. Not everything has shifted. There is still a whole lot of things that are very, very hard about working with government, but some things have definitely shifted, hence the sort of talk, right, that government has redecorated. And I feel like I can sort of say that from the inside, because we're in a very unique position as Creative HQ. Creative HQ is wholly owned by government. We are kind of like a government entity, but we operate independently. We have an independent board. No one can shut us down on a political cycle or a political whim, and we don't sort of get funding per se by government. These are sort of things we have to win and compete for on the open market. So we've got like a bit of a unique position in the market, but we can be trusted and sort of be that voice of reason, hopefully, and government can feel like we're a little bit on the inside. So what I want to do is talk to you, as I say, about where we've come from, why I think there's so much resistance to change and working in the ways that I'm sure you're all very capable of working, how a handful of teams have managed to break through the resistance factors that mean it's so hard to deliver value in government, talking about the operating environment and why it's a little bit different now to what it has been perhaps in the past, what hasn't changed, and a bit about what the next decade might look like. So my sort of analogy here is that I think we've been in a bit of an innovation, shall we say, GovTech, an innovation summer in at least Wellington for the last 10 years. not a great summer, but a summer nonetheless. And agencies have been really willing to talk about innovation, talk about design principles, and I think that was completely needed from the previous 10 years, which was just big old clunky IT systems. And actually for the last 10 years, they've been willing to talk to the end users, they've got out of the building, they've really understood the problem. At least those at the sort of front half of the bell curve, right? For those who are wanting to do things differently. They saw that there was frustration out there from the public, from all of partners like you, that government weren't very good at understanding the problem. Well, I think now, 10 years later, they actually are good at understanding the problem, right? They do get out of the building and they do talk to people a lot about what is going on, and this has been very positive. I think that's a global phenomenon. I know we've seen innovation programs of this type of thing emerge all around the world. The UK had their GDS, the US has the US digital service, and 18F Australia had DTA. So like there is all of these innovation programs that are starting to change the way that government has been working. In New Zealand, we've had all sorts of initiatives. I've been running the GovTech Accelerator here since 2018, and we had a pre-version as well. There was something called the DIA Service Innovation Lab, and service designers throughout government really took off, and all of this type of thing. But yet there's still this gap, there's still this gap where so much promise is given and talked about, but there's this, when it comes to being delivered, there's a huge disconnect. I once worked on a project in 2018, and in a few months they created a really valuable insight, and they got funded, and I met with them 5 years later, and that project had been continually funded for 5 years, and it had a project team working on it for 5 years, and they were basically no further ahead than we had been in that first 3 months of working with them. It was crazy, right? For those of you who were at Alex's talk earlier in the day, they worked on a project where after 4 months we had a delivered piece of kit that was able to deliver real value. It's the same sort of public service that's on one hand thinking it's working innovatively and delivers nothing after 5 years, and on the other hand it's actually possible to ship something. So I guess that's that implementation gap. It's still real and it still exists all over the world. And it creates this idea of innovation theatre. You've probably all heard this idea before, where there's thousands of blooming flowers, these projects in government that look innovative, look creative and customer-centric, but they often go nowhere. They don't actually deliver real outcomes to real people. The OECD have what I think is the simplest and best example of innovation, and that is it something new or a novel idea? Does it add value, and is it implemented? And like so often we do those first two, and we really struggle, particularly we being in government, really struggle with that third one of actually implementing it. It'll sit just like that project I mentioned did from 2018, and 5 years later it was still sitting on the shelf. I'd hate to think how much money was spent on it, but it didn't provide the much needed value in the justice sector to victims of crime that it was set out to deliver. But actually, there's reasons for this as well. It's not the fault necessarily of the public sector. The system is set up for it to be very, very hard. In the private sector, we work a lot with startups at Creative HQ, and ultimately, the resistance to delivering value is two-dimensional. You require cash, you require funding, and you require customers. If you've got product market fit and you've got customers, you kind of, product market fit, and capital to grow, you're kind of off to the races. And in a government sense, there's a third dimension, and that is what I've been touching on, is this idea of resistance. So I think of it a little bit like a mountain. So bear with me here. This is my analogy. Excuse me. This is my analogy. for government to be able to achieve, it has to climb up the front face of this mountain. And this resistance that it faces is real. We've all heard the challenges. It's the political cycle and the election cycle that means 3 years, the changes are incurred. You have the short-termism of government in general. You have, of course, the tech interoperability issues. You have slow decision-making. You have key personnel changes. You have risk aversion. And like I say, risk aversion is built into the system. It's actually there intentionally, but it of course limits us when it comes to experimenting and trialing. And government says it wants to experiment and trial things, but just don't you dare get it wrong, which is such a hard thing to compete with. Siloed funding is another one. When you're dealing with these problems, so often they touch on multiple issues across, a person's life when you're dealing with a government sense. It doesn't respect the siloed boundaries of a funding pot, but of course the agency does, and that just creates problems and frictions, and you can't really deliver the value that you're trying to deliver for the end user because the funding boundaries do respect those departmental borders, which of course the others don't. And the other one I want to touch on just briefly is the decision-making incentives. In the public sector, it is about, in the private sector, ultimately you're rewarded for revenue generation or cost savings. In the public sector, it's about delivering public value. But what is public value? It's very hard to put a metric on it. So there's a proxy often, which is like the size of the team, the size of the work program, how big the budget was. And therefore, there's incentives for a project manager or an owner to make their budget big, their team large, and these things just slow down and cause problems, and it makes the project really drag out as well. So, as I say, none of this is laziness necessarily, and it's not just bureaucratic nonsense. It's sort of there intentionally, and we have to work with it. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to deliver the value. The trick, though, is that there is a tipping point. There is a tipping point at the top of this resistance mountain where if you get there, everything changes. And the view down the other side can be very, very different. When you progress down to value, the resistance can melt away, you can build momentum, and you can actually start to get things done. And there's a trick, right? The trick here is that you can actually leapfrog the front face of the mountain. And I say that because to get to this point, I was very frustrated. A couple of years ago, everything in Wellington just ground to a halt. Our project work stopped, and I was sitting there going, let's do a bit of analysis. And I reviewed 62 different public sector innovation projects, and a very small number of them actually went on to deliver real value, right? So these were 62 successful public sector innovation projects. Very few of them actually went on to deliver real value. And those that did, all except for one or two who just did it through sheer force and determination and knowing the right people, did something which was they got straight to the tipping point by leapfrogging all of those resistance factors. And it's really quite simple. The trick is, can you deliver real value to real people inside the current constraints of the operating environment? Not theoretical value, not value that requires an extra data feed, an extra policy change, some sort of regulation change, some sort of contingent value on something else. Can you deliver real value to real people inside that current constraint? And as soon as projects did that, they seemed to just build momentum and run down the back face of the mountain. It's so much harder to turn off a project from a political perspective. And when I say political, I don't necessarily mean like big government, but even internally in a government department, right? It's so much harder to turn off the value of a project if you've delivered real value and it's not like it's currently working, because a team somewhere says, oh, don't turn that off. No, we like that. That actually works. Keep that. And your project can build and deliver real value. The frustrating thing is how to get there, because so often someone requires a business case, they require a RFP process, they require something big and gnarly and slow. but you've sort of got to just leave those people because they're the back of the bell curve. You need to be working with people the front of the bell curve. The draggers will always sort of want to do it the traditional way, but there's a growing bubble, and I think, maybe let's optimistically call it half of project managers get it, and if you can explain this to them, they generally get it and are on board. Let's not spend 100 grand writing a business case or a requirements list. Let's just see what we can build. Let's take 20 grand and just build the first part of it and see if we can add value. I came up with this myself. All you designers in the room, just if you actually flick it, if you flick that, it's a better representation of the momentum that your project has. On that, initially your project momentum just dies and dies and dies to the point where generally they're dead and it's so hard to come back from. But if you can somehow get there, the momentum can really grow. So I think that's so important for us just to be aware of, that government has a context, it has that third dimension, there is a way to overcome it, and I've seen this, and it aligns with the current narrative of government. So the sort of analogy, I don't necessarily know if this is the world's best analogy, but the beachhead analogy from a military perspective, right, is when you land on the beachhead, you don't just liberate the whole nation in a day. The idea of the beachhead is that you land there, you sort of eke out a little bit for yourself and sort of hold what you can and then expand from there. And that's kind of the value here. It doesn't you don't want it to be conditional on something else. We're only going to land on the beachhead if. So yeah, that's my point there. What can we take? What can we hold right now, which is valuable, and hold it, not let someone turn it off and just prove it. So it might be small. It might not even be the most critical part of the project. It just has to be something that works. There's a bunch of international examples that I think have followed this model that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, so I won't go into in detail. But it's such Estonia, I know, boring Estonia. But we've all heard it 100 times, but they had this huge opportunity in Estonia to completely change their digital public infrastructure, and they did such an incredible job of it, and they did it without waiting. The progress of it, when you sort of look at the history, was so fast. They didn't wait for a policy change. They didn't wait for complete political buy-in. They just sort of made incremental changes, and they've been doing it now for 20 years, and they've got, a really advanced digital public infrastructure system to the point where 99% of citizens interact with their government completely online, completely seamlessly, and they have a very, very high customer satisfaction rate. The GovTech agency in Singapore is the same. They treat digital first as a strategic national asset, in a very Singaporean way, and they get so much value out of it. Denmark is another one. Israel is another one. These countries have done such a good job of not necessarily having to get everything right from the start, but just keep taking it, keep growing that next step. I heard an interview with the person who started UK gov.uk, and he was having all this pressure for the big release because the government had promised £1 billion was going to be spent on this thing, and they had to do this big release and blah blah blah. And he pushed back to the point it almost cost him his job, because he knew that if they went out and promised all this thing and went out with a big bang, it would inevitably fail. Instead, he knew he just had to land somewhere small, take a little bit of value, and grow from there. And it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we've got here from a digital perspective. I think for those of you who heard Alex's talk earlier, this was a project that we had a lot of fun on. And were able to deliver. So the problem that we were faced with from Department of Conservation, is that they had a $52 million problem where weeds in New Zealand cost the Department of Conservation $52 million a year, and that's not to mention, the $1 billion liability of wilding pines and etc., etc. We have 25,000 weeds in people's back gardens waiting to jump the fence and become weeds. And the problem was, no one really had any sort of a system for getting those weeds early. We all know that the cost of eradication is 100x cheaper than the cost of managing or trying to remove weeds when they're established. And they had no platform for doing that. Yet all of the data actually existed. So they had no alert system. So basically, over a very short amount of time, sort of 3 to 4 months, from problem statement all the way through to how might this work, through working with X equals to actually develop out a working prototype, a working thing that people could actually log on to, actually get alerted for when a new weed infestation was alerted via a whole number of databases that already existed, we just had to plug into, including citizen science databases via Naturalist. They were able to get real alerts based on their geographical area of choice, based on their individual weed or weed list of choice, based on the number of observations that have taken place in that particular geographical area. That might be as small as, Mount Victoria Park through to the North Island. All of those options were available, were available to them. And they could have taken a multi-year big RFP approach, but they didn't. And it was because there was a project manager in there who wanted to try and do something a different way. She saw the vision, she saw the desire. She had a very tight budget that she was able to sort of convince her managers to give her. And as soon as we were able to give them back something that was really valuable, the budget, went 3x like that. And then there was another round, and then they're like, oh, actually, Ministry for Primary Industries, who are currently dealing with $1 billion problem of gold clam, this actually could work for that. And all these other, Didimo and all these other organisms, M. bovis, who they spend crazy amounts of money on, the same platform could be used for that. So they're then starting to increase the feature list. And now, sort of 18 months on, it's much more expansive, it's much more like legit, and actually, can start delivering to real people and real outcomes. So, what have I done? I've got all lost. That's okay. What next? What next? Eh? Yeah. Should have numbered my pages. I just pulled out reason is I wrote a paper and I just sort of copied the paper and was using the headings. But yeah, anyway. Where am I? Sorry, team. What's changed? Here we go. So why now? So there's lots of reasons why I think now is a better time than there's ever been before, from a structural perspective for this. I think, first of all, the rhetoric has changed. In government, actually, there's a rhetoric of, we should be experimenting. Maybe we should be trying stuff. There's still this underlying current of, yeah, we want you to experiment, just don't get anything wrong. But at least the rhetoric is there. At least they're saying the right things. As I said, that is definitely not flowing through to an operational approach, but it has started to change. So firstly, procurement. End of last year, we had our procurement rules change, which you could easily argue they didn't go far enough, and they didn't, but at least they changed. And now you basically have to spend, if you're spending under 100 grand, you have to spend it with a New Zealand company, unless you have a very, very good reason not to. For any procurement that you're doing over 100 grand, you still have to prove the NZ Inc. value. So when you're writing or responding to RFPs, talk up that fact. There's a 10% weighting for NZ Inc. value, and you're instantly 10% ahead of your big legacy competition, a big whatever international shop, if you can talk about the procurement, if you can talk about the NZ Inc. value for those over ones. The second one is that the business case process has changed. So government uses the same business case process as Australia. It's called the Better Business Case. You're probably all very familiar. And literally last month, a new version came out in New Zealand, which is about 100 times better. It literally reduces the time to develop a business case from minimum months to days. And you can use AI to basically turn it from an initial problem statement through to initial options. So what that means is you can work with agencies to very quickly spin up different options, in a much, much cheaper way. So they can still go through their traditional political process, but no one in government yet knows how to do it. It was basically a very small release on the Treasury website, and it's going to take 6 months probably for people to start knowing about it. So there's a real opportunity there. Of course, AI is another structural change, right? That means government thinks, you've probably all had to explain to government folk how AI isn't actually magic, right? But they think it is, and there is an opportunity there to leverage that, to sort of get them thinking, oh, we can do this faster, we can do this cheaper, we can do this in an experimentation way. So definitely lean into government's need to use AI. They've claimed that they have 272 use cases for AI that are ready to be deployed, but haven't yet been built. And the pressure on them to actually deliver those is building, because there's a new government agency here called the GDDA, which is the Government Digital Delivery Agency, that has been set up for exactly 2 weeks. And they do have capable people in there, because it just got moved from Department of Internal Affairs. And they are under pressure to start delivering on some of these AI promises, because they've been saying we've got 172 use cases that aren't yet delivering any value for 12 months now, and they still haven't at least produced anything publicly that is of value. So I think there's a real opportunity there. The DDDA is also talking about their digital public infrastructure and why they need it. I'm not a Drupal expert, but I know the GovCMS platform and some really underlying core values, and that's the exact type thing that the government is talking about at the moment. We've got a new commissioner, which is kind of like, the Public Service Commissioner, who's like the boss, the person who hires all the CEs of different agencies, and he's saying in no uncertain terms, and he's known for being ruthless, he just decimated our science industry last year in another role. He is saying, you as agencies, you will use reusable things. You will not build the same thing between all your agencies. We will not let you. And they've changed the rules to the point that they can approve or deny digital spending. So if you are, building something that's a one-off bespoke, they will have the ability to say no. They won't catch everything, of course, but they have the ability to say no, and they're demanding reusable infrastructure. And of course, an open source platform is absolutely gold for that narrative. And the last one I'll touch on is actually the GovTech ecosystem. And I think actually in Wellington, there's been 10 years of this sort of developing and growing. And it feels like we're finally at the point where startups are ready to engage again based on government being more willing to work with them. And there's a bit of a groundswell of startups who are working in interesting spaces that can, I think, snowball and show the momentum to government that there's a real opportunity here for them to dive onto. So just sort of to close out, I guess I really want to see people participating back in government and not being so burnt by it. And I think there's lots of things there that show that there is this groundswell from government to start working in these new ways. So I guess my sort of title was all about trying to entice you back to government. And I'm sure you've all been sitting there going, oh, well, we would like to, that's great. But showing managers that actually there are different ways. You don't have to follow a traditional procurement process. You should try this different business case writing in order to get your funding earlier and to experiment with a small pot of money. All of these things are like building in the favour, I think, of small independent vendors, unlike they have been ever, at least in the 10, 12 years that I've been operating in this sort of ecosystem. This was for a talk that I actually gave yesterday at a public sector innovation conference. This sort of slide, you may or may not be interested in sort of a government style paper that I wrote, but I've written all of this up in a sort of paper, in a document that I just released yesterday to government, in the hope that actually they read this and they sort of hear this narrative and hear these messages and actually think, oh yeah, how am I experimenting on this project? Because I talk to leaders regularly who have, you know, 100, 200, 500, $2 million projects coming down their pipeline in the next 2 years, and the default to them is, you know, the track that they think, the standard track to get across the desert. And I'm saying, well, no, there's a motorway across the desert, but the motorway sort of doesn't actually get to where you want it to go. You know, you think it's this main way that everyone uses, but there's so many different options. You can use different vendors and be more creative and actually get to the location that you want to get to. So that was my intention. So yeah, I've written that, and if that's of interest, would love to hear your feedback from a technical lens and from a developer's angle and a designer's angle, over and above just sort of a bureaucrat, as it were. So yeah, that's what I had to share. Thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting to anyone afterwards as well, and if there was any questions. So.
Hi. So you spoke to a bunch of people yesterday about this, but on the government side. And how did that go down? Was there any aha moments from people, or was it like, oh yes, this sounds like the kind of thing people talk about, and this is going to be fun?
Yeah. It was so I was sandwiched between the two people who I wanted to hear this more than anyone. Unfortunately, they're government ministers, so they only walk in the room the second before they talk. But the minister was before me, and the Sir Brian Roach, the new commissioner, was after. And both of their talks really mirrored the same thing. But they didn't talk about the experimentation. They talked about the digital public infrastructure. They talked about you know, building common things across the system. They talked about how things were going to change. They talked about resource constraints. They talked about personnel and how we need to be sharing personnel between agencies. But none of them, and they all talked about how we need to sort of build momentum and get down the other side of that and build smaller and but none of them talked about the resistance factors that were there, and none of them talked about the how to experiment to deliver, to get to that tipping point. So that's the part that everyone said to me afterwards was lacking and was the real sort of meat in the sandwich, as it were. So yeah, a lot of sort of positive aha moments, and you know, yeah, it felt like most people in the audience got their phone out and scanned the code, so yeah, that's my reflection, Tom. Yeah.
Thanks for that, and I agree that this approach works really well, sort of building on things. I do worry with government sometimes that when we tell them, oh, we can do these nice little bits of innovation and experiment, that it gives them an out on actually fixing the stuff that needs fixing. Like there's a lot of these things where you go, these are things that don't need regulatory change, but if you just did the regulatory change, that would be a lot better. And I wonder if you've got thoughts on how we, I suppose, don't let people get away from actually there's change that's needed, especially for technology, because there's some stuff you can just do, and there's some stuff that does need it, and don't let them go, we'll just do the nice, easy stuff, because we've certainly had enough instances of doing fun innovation and isn't that nice, and then eventually you run into a wall and getting that wall to go down.
Yeah. I guess, yes, and I think that was the starting point, and that's where we were, a few years ago, is we need to change those structural things, but it's so hard for one little thing, unless there's a bigger political movement, to get something real changed, unless you can demonstrate the value. So that's why I think if you really show a real piece, not just show a real piece of value, deliver it and show that you can't get any further down that mountain without that change, but the momentum will hopefully carry you through that. But if you don't sort of go over that tipping point and down the other side by delivering real value, there's no momentum to crush through that thing, and it will remain a thing that we have to do, but it's just too hard. They've got so many priorities. Changing that piece of legislation or, underlying, data flow or whatever it might be that needs to change is too hard without like some sort of momentum crusher. It does happen from time to time, especially at the really big end of town. But there's, for every 3 transformation projects that are happening of big legacy things, there's like 1,000 smaller projects that can happen. So. Yeah. Like the media has such a big role to play, right? Because they're scared of the media putting out a story where they've wasted something. So I think if government and any project can get ahead of that by talking about the experimentation, when I'm talking to sort of senior leaders about, this is all very great, but how do we experiment? How do we de-risk it? And one thing that I've been trying to get people to do, and we do it at Creative HQ, is actually put in the KPIs. Have we run an experiment? How many experiments have we run? Have we tested something? So that the metric isn't did it work or did it fail, because of course government hates the idea of something failing. But actually the metric is binary. Did we run the experiment? Yes, no. And if we didn't, it's a red circle on the KPI list. And if we did, it's a green circle. The sort of outcome is secondary. So that's a way to get them being more comfortable with the idea of experimenting. But then the media one is the $1 million question, How do you change the media's perception? And the best that I've come up with, and collectively, because I once was a part of an unconference in this very room, and one of our topics was how do we get media to change the narrative, is if you get ahead of it by saying, yes, we've done this thing, but the alternate was either the status quo, which is not working for all of these reasons, or we spend $100 million on this big transformational change, and as we know, the OECD claims that whatever it was, somewhere less than 50% of massive government transformational projects actually deliver the desired outcome. So we're going to take this deliberate approach to carve off a much, much smaller amount of money and do this thing that might not work. And if you can get ahead on the narrative of the alternate was status quo or spending this very large amount of money, so instead we're doing this little thing, is the only thought that really has landed in anywhere, because media obviously love to bash government and they're such a big target to do.
Jonnie, I have a question. A lot of the subtext is talking about how hard it is to innovate with government, maybe as a private sector perspective or as a vendor or a hosting company. Do you see government doing a good job of recognising the value of the people that it has in-house at the moment, those innovators, fostering kind of stories of large or small innovation that delivers better public services, spends the money well and achieves those outcomes? Is it doing a better job of those types of factors, do you know?
Yeah, when there are wins, they do love to sing about them, definitely. The SWAT one, before it had even sort of gone live, they were putting it in their end of year annual report, alongside massive big $100 million projects, $100 million project, $40,000 project. So they do like to latch onto them, but the problem is, or the hard part, is getting that momentum, getting that to scale to other projects and getting that wider buy-in. And ultimately, the sort of small number of people that really get it and want to change can find it so hard to get budget approval, and do anything. So, yeah, Do they appreciate it? No, I think is the short answer. But a small amount of people do get it, and when you find those people, triple down on them. Stick to the people who get it and want to operate differently.